He washed his hands so many times a day that his own staff quietly recalculated how much soap the household needed to order. He could order the deaths of entire cities with a single signature, and he could not stand to touch a doorknob without disappearing minutes later to scrub his hands raw. Keep that contradiction in your mind, because it is about to get much stranger. We are going to call what he had by its clinical name, Mysophobia, the pathological fear of contamination, of dirt, of the invisible biological world crawling across every surface a human being touches. In most people, this fear looks small, embarrassing even. In him, it looked like something else entirely. Discipline, control, an iron will that historians spent decades praising without understanding what they were actually looking at. They were looking at a nervous system stuck in permanent threat detection, not against bombs, not against armies, not against assassins, against something invisible, microscopic, and constant. And the identity of this man is not the point of this story yet. What is happening inside his skull is the point, because it is also happening inside yours. Here is the part that should unsettle you before we go any further. The exact neural circuit behind his private terror is sitting in your own head right now. It is called the insula, a folded structure buried deep in the cortex, and its only job is disgust. It fires when you see mold spreading across bread. It fires when you smell spoiled milk. It fires when you simply imagine touching something unclean. It evolved for one reason: to keep early humans away from pathogens before anyone understood germ theory, back when instinctive revulsion was the only defense available. Your insula is running the same program his did. The only difference between you and him is calibration, and calibration, it turns out, can break. This fear did not begin with power. It began with a death, and the death is where this story actually starts. An 18-year-old boy stood at his mother's bedside and watched her body deteriorate under a treatment that looked less like medicine and more like torture. Her physician applied caustic chemical compounds directly onto the wound, over and over, for months, in a slow and agonizing attempt to burn the disease out of her. The physician later wrote that he had never seen a young man so shattered by grief in his entire career. That sentence, buried in a private medical account for decades, is very likely the encoding event. The exact moment a threat memory was written into the amygdala, the almond-shaped structure in the brain responsible for fear, in a way that would never fully release. The amygdala does not need repetition to form a permanent association. One experience, saturated with enough emotional intensity, can write itself into the architecture of a mind and run there forever. Disease, deterioration, a body betraying itself from the inside in front of someone who could do nothing but watch. For that 18-year-old, biological corruption stopped being an abstract idea. It became the thing that had just taken his mother apart. If you have ever avoided a hospital, avoided even hearing the name of a disease that took someone you loved, some version of this exact mechanism has already fired inside your own skull. You did not choose it. Your amygdala made that decision for you, and it made it permanently. Now watch what happens when that same 18-year-old grows up to hold absolute power over an entire nation. The fear did not fade. It organized itself into a private infrastructure of avoidance, invisible to the public, documented only by the people forced to live inside it with him. He avoided handshakes whenever he could. When he could not, aides reported that he would find a reason to excuse himself shortly afterward and disappear to wash. He kept a visible distance from anyone who looked unwell, changing seats, cutting meetings short, growing uneasy at the sound of a single passing cough. His staff described his obsession with cleanliness at the dinner table as extreme even by the standards of his own household, his own cutlery, his own glass, a deep, constant suspicion toward food that had passed through too many hands before it reached his plate. And there is more. There is a detail about his diet that biographers still argue over, one that connects directly back to that bedside in 1907, and it is stranger than almost anything else in this story. Some historians link his committed vegetarianism to a visceral disgust response toward meat itself, toward decay, toward the biological process of a body breaking down after death. Disgust is not a moral position. It is a physiological one, and it lives in the insula, the exact structure activated by the sight of spoiled food. For a man whose formative trauma was watching a body decompose under disease, that structure may never have learned the difference between rotting meat and mortality itself. But the strangest evidence of all comes from his personal physician, a man named Theodore Morel, and what Morel was permitted to do to him for over a decade should genuinely disturb you. Injections, vitamin compounds, hormonal preparations, experimental formulations, dozens of them, administered almost daily in the later years. An obsessive medical regimen that multiple contemporaries believed had nothing to do with any diagnosed illness and everything to do with a terror of physical decline, of internal corruption, of the same slow biological betrayal that had killed his mother. He did not trust his own body to stay clean of disease on its own. He needed constant ritualized intervention just to feel safe inside his own skin. And still, none of this tells you who he is yet. It only tells you what fear does to a mind, regardless of whose mind it happens to occupy. Here is where the science gets uncomfortable, because it does not stay contained to one man in one century. A landmark study on contamination fear at the University of British Columbia found that compulsive washing behavior has almost nothing to do with actual hygiene outcomes. Participants kept washing long after any measurable cleanliness benefit had already been reached. When asked why, they said the washing was driven entirely by internal distress, not external dirt. The behavior was never about the germs. It was about silencing an alarm that refuses to stop ringing. Sit with that, because it reframes everything you thought you understood about the word clean. If you have ever washed your hands a second time, not because they were still dirty, but because something inside you had not settled yet, you were not responding to bacteria. You were responding to your own insula, refusing to lower a threat signal that had already done its job. The gap between the physical world and what your nervous system believes about the physical world is where every contamination phobia actually lives, in a private mansion in wartime Germany, or in your own bathroom at 2 a.m. Now the story turns, because this fear did not stay confined to hygiene. It metastasized. And this is the moment you find out exactly who we have been describing. His name was Adolf Hitler, and historians examining his later political rhetoric have long noted the disturbing frequency with which he described his enemies using the exact vocabulary of disease, infection, parasite, poison, contamination of the blood. This was not a coincidental turn of phrase from a man who happened to be squeamish about germs. This was a nervous system's primary threat category, biological contamination, projected outward from the personal onto the political, onto an entire people, with consequences you already know. This is the darkest implication in the entire story, and it is one that clinical psychology and history rarely allow to sit in the same sentence. A private fear, rooted in one bedside memory from 1907, did not stay private. It did not stay confined to hand washing and cutlery and a physician's daily injections. It became the language of an ideology that dehumanized millions of people by encoding them, quite literally, as the contamination his amygdala had never stopped searching for since he was 18 years old. We are not telling you this to explain away what happened. Nothing explains it away. No neuroscience paper, no clinical framework softens what this machinery was ultimately used to justify. Monstrousness on that scale requires ideology, propaganda, a functioning state, and the willing participation of millions of people who made their own choices. A phobia did not build camps, but the fact that one man's disgust circuitry found its way into the vocabulary of genocide should tell you something uncomfortable about how thin the line actually is between a private neurological misfire and a public catastrophe, when that misfire happens to occur inside a mind that also holds absolute power. And here is where you have to ask yourself something you may not want to ask. The insula in your own brain, generating your own disgust response right now, does not know the difference between spoiled food and a person you have decided to see as unclean. It fires on both. It cannot tell you which one is rational. That judgment call was never its job. Every act of dehumanization in history that used the language of disease or filth toward another group of human beings was not inventing a new psychological mechanism. It was hijacking the oldest one your brain has, the one that was only ever supposed to keep you away from rotten meat. We still do not have a full clinical picture of exactly how severe his contamination anxiety actually was, because the man never sat for an evaluation, never spoke to a psychiatrist in any documented clinical setting. Every account comes secondhand, reconstructed by aides and biographers after the fact. What we are left with instead is a pattern that shows up in laboratory studies of ordinary people who wash their hands until their skin cracks. A pattern that shows up in the language used to justify the worst atrocity of the 20th century. A pattern that is, at this exact moment, sitting quietly in your own skull, deciding what counts as dirty long before your conscious mind has any say in the matter. The uncomfortable truth here is not really about him at all. It is about the machinery he happened to be running, standard equipment, pre-installed in every human brain, tuned by millions of years of evolution to keep you away from things that could kill you before medicine existed to explain why. Most of the time it protects you quietly, and you never think about it. But the same circuit that makes you flinch from a moldy piece of bread is capable, under the wrong conditions, of deciding an entire category of human beings belongs in that same rejected category. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal neurological pathway historians and psychologists now believe was activated over and over inside a mind that then had the power to act on it at the scale of a continent. He hid his fear because a man who wanted to appear untouchable could not be seen flinching from a doorknob. What he could not hide is the far more disturbing fact that the fear he spent his life concealing did not stay locked inside his own hands. It found its way into his words, and his words became policy. The next time you feel that small, specific wave of revulsion towards something that has done you no actual harm, it might be worth asking where the line really is, between an old survival instinct doing its job and something else entirely, quietly deciding who gets to be human and who does not.